Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're going to go over some of the major findings from the 2023 Unit 42 Attack Surface Threat Report. In this report, there are findings from expert analysis of exposures from over 250 plus organizations across the world, covering a time period of 12 months. My name is Abhi. I work in product marketing for Cortex Xpanse. And today I have with me Dr. Matt Craning and Ross Warden. Matt, could you please go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Craning. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Xpanse, which created the Attack Surface Management product category.
Ross, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ross Warden. I'm a senior consulting director here at Unit 42, where I lead large incident response engagements and innovate new product offerings for our clients.
Thank you both so much for taking the time and being here with us today. Matt, one of the first things that jumps out in the report is that it is based on observed data. What is this data, and how does the team get access to this data?
That's a great question, Abhi. To create our products, Xpanse operates a public data collection infrastructure from hundreds of points around the world on the public internet. And every day, we actually gather over 500 billion different pieces of information about all internet connected systems. And we use that information primarily for two purposes: to attribute if a system is potentially risky or vulnerable, and also to attribute it to an organization. And that's where this data comes from. So by looking at all internet connected systems, we can then look at, in this report, over 250 organizations, see every asset that they have that is directly on the public internet, and if it is in a risky or misconfigured state.
That's excellent, Matt. This entire report is based on actual exposure data. And so one of the findings that was a bit concerning is how the constant change in the cloud is essentially resulting in lots of exposures. I think the stat on the report was nearly 50% of all new high critical exposures that arise in any given month are on account of this massive change in the cloud. Can you talk a little bit about it? What do we mean by cloud flux? Why does it change so frequently?
Not a problem. So when we look at the cloud, we look at every single service that an organization has in a hosting provider that is not in their own on-premises data centers. Mm-hmm. And this covers both things that they know about, such as accounts in known AWS and known Azure. But one of the largest differences is the accounts that companies have through traditional CSPs that they know about are only a fraction of where they actually have cloud presence, because anyone in the organization with a P card can actually become an IT systems administrator in 5 minutes if they want to. And it's the ease with which new IT can be spun up anywhere in the world by nearly anyone in the organization that leads to a substantially higher number of systems for organizations being in the cloud, being created in daily and even hourly basis. And that's what our report indicates is actually where more than half of their most severe risks lie, is in these new software-based systems, less so in on-prem, though there are still risks there as well.
Matt, thank you for that. Ross, you have responded to several critical incidents across organizations. In your time, how often have you seen a cloud misconfiguration leading to an unknown or potentially unmanaged exposure across these engagements?
Absolutely. The answer is a staggering amount and an unfortunate amount. We really work with our clients to try and get them ahead of these kinds of incidents because they are preventable. It's often a simple switch that you just toggle off and your environment is much safer because you've done that. But when you don't know that cloud environment exists, because like Matt said, somebody decided, hey, I just need some new infrastructure. I'm going to get my company card and go spin up an AWS account. That can be devastating, especially if you think of embedding, secrets and keys and connections to your backend databases. What seems like an innocent, cloud environment that was stood up for a perfectly good reason, but not in a compliant way, can lead to devastating results for the entire enterprise.
Thank you. And on the topic of responding to incidents, one of the startling discoveries in this report is the eye-popping pace at which attackers are exploiting exposures when a new zero-day comes out. I think the stat in the report was there were certain remote code exploit vulnerabilities which were exploited within hours of them being disclosed publicly. Matt, how are attackers finding these exposures so quickly?
So when a zero day is created and kind of dropped on the community publicly, what we're actually seeing is that attackers can now utilize simple, widely available internet scanning technologies for cost of at most a few hundreds of dollars, enumerate every single vulnerable internet system. Previously, they would have had to kind of choose targets of choice. And they would have been focused on particular networks, done more intense reconnaissance of those. Due to automation technologies that are now freely available and easily downloadable by anyone, including malicious actors, every single system that's vulnerable becomes a target of opportunity, because once you have exploit code, launching it against every single internet connected system is very low cost and very highly automatable by attackers. That's why we're seeing these attacks scale from one code exploit to attempting to exploit every single vulnerable system on the internet within hours.
So they're being opportunistic when an opportunity presents itself. Ross, when you are called into such situations, what's the first thing you do as an incident response expert?
Sure. I think it's important here to distinguish. Historically, the first thing we would always do is gather as much telemetry as we could internally about the client's environment. Do we have authentication logs, authorization logs, et cetera? And we still do that. But now, with tools like Xpanse, we are able to simultaneously kick off an outside-in view that we then marry up with the inside-out view. And that often results in us finding, patient zero or the initial infection vector, that kind of thing, much more quickly. And even if it doesn't, we may find other vulnerabilities that other attackers are trying to break into while we're responding to the first incident. So having that inside out and outside in view in tandem is critical for us.
Matt, how important is visibility when organizations want to immediately respond to these internet-wide emergencies?
Visibility and inventory is foundational in any response. If you don't have a complete, current, and accurate inventory, which unfortunately is the case for most organizations in the world, you're doing firefighting with Microsoft Office, traditionally Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Outlook. And those are great tools, but they're not actually designed for security effectiveness. And what this really manifests as a lot of wasted time and wasted effort just at when you're most vulnerable, because you don't know both all of the assets you have that might be vulnerable. It's also difficult to validate, even if somebody has fixed a fraction of the assets you have that might be vulnerable, if that is actually getting propagated and centrally maintained, so that it becomes a game of telephone just at when an organization is its most vulnerable. They actually lack the tools and the processes to efficiently and effectively solve the problem. And what this ultimately leads to is both very high labor costs, but also a remediation timeline that can take weeks and even months in certain cases, as opposed to days or hours, which is the time speeds with which attackers operate.
Right. 0 days are one thing. At least organizations have an idea of what they're looking for. But one of the other things that this report highlights is how there are several exposures, many of them offering very little resistance and lots of opportunities for attackers to essentially breach an organization. I think the leading attack surface exposure that this report highlights in the last 12 months is something called Web Framework Takeover Exposures. Matt, can you talk a little bit about what a Web Framework Takeover Exposure is and why it is particularly bad for organizations that have these exposures?
Sure. So web frameworks such as jQuery, PHP, are very common components used in web servers that are by far the most prevalent asset for organizations. And why these are risky is that they're very frequently checked by attackers for vulnerabilities. And web servers are very frequently exposed to the internet intentionally by organizations. However, when they're not updated frequently because they might not be centrally tracked, then you have assets out there on the internet that anyone in the world can talk with and interact with, including in malicious ways, but which is not necessarily receiving all of your security patches. And it's this perfect storm of, as we've seen with digital transformation, organizations have more and more things online, just as attackers are checking more and more for these kinds of risks.
That's very interesting, Matt. One of the other risks that I saw in this report that I wanted to talk a little bit about was remote access risks. Nearly 1 out of every 5 exposure that the team looked at was related to some sort of remote access service being accessible publicly on the internet by pretty much anyone and everyone. Can you tell us a little bit about what is a remote access service and why is exposing this really bad?
Absolutely. Remote access services in general are largely efficiency tools that IT teams use to address problems remotely. So if anyone's ever had a problem with their own laptop and asked IT to come in and address the problem, in most cases, it's not a physical person coming over to your desk, or these days coming and paying you a home visit. It's actually them using software that is installed on your laptop to remotely administer your system, do legitimate things, help make your system better, and improve these. However, unfortunately, most of these technologies, one of the most prevalent is something called Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP, were designed to really only be exposed in trusted environments that had a lot of legacy assumptions, such as being on an enterprise network in a protected enclave. And with both the rise of remote work and just the number of different ways these systems can manifest on the internet, very frequently, we find that these systems that are designed for legitimate IT people to help the organization are exposed in ways that they were not intended to be. Mm-hmm. Attackers can take advantage of them because these systems are generally not designed with security in mind. And when exploited, they give very deep administrative access to the system in question, allowing the attacker to effectively masquerade as a legitimate IT administrator, which is very concerning.
Right. And Ross, on that point, I was looking at one of the older incident response reports, and it said that in nearly 50% of the cases, they found that such systems did not have multi-factor authentication or any sort of security settings for that matter enabled. Is this normal? Do you see this across your IR engagements?
Unfortunately, it is normal. And I think echoing what Matt said, the goal with a lot of these tools is really, if you think of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the goal is availability, right? You want a quick and easy way to get in to help your people do their jobs, and that's a good thing. However, when they aren't properly secured or they are stood up in a temporary way, we say that there's nothing more permanent than the temporary, right? You stand something up temporarily, you never take it down, you forget, that gets exploited later on. And in cloud environments too, you may say stand up a telnet server and leave it running, and somebody else might change the access controls to your environment and expose your telnet server without you knowing it. So yes, we see this quite frequently, and we tell people that it is critical when you're going to expose a service like this, that you do it intentionally, that you really examine whether you have to, how you're going to do it, and how you're going to turn it back off once you're done, so it's not left hanging out there on the internet.
Right, that's extremely concerning, especially when you look at the report and it found that over 85% of the organizations that they looked at had some form of remote access service exposed to the public internet. Matt, Ross said it's very important to be intentional about exposing these services. What are some potential reasons that these services are being exposed, perhaps accidentally or otherwise?
When we talk with customers after finding these systems online, helping them do a remediation and then identify the root cause, very frequently and very concerningly, in many cases, these are employee laptops that are actually directly on the public internet. And by this, we mean not that they're at someone's home behind a router, behind a NAT, but that actually anyone in the world could send packets directly to that employee laptop. And the way that laptops are configured were never to be directly internet accessible, because there are systems that IT teams install like RDP that allow them on a protected enclave to log in naturally. But when that laptop is taken outside of that enclave and insecurely connected to the public internet, then you have many, many, many employees in a very heterogeneous networking environment that none of their laptops were configured to be in. And that is actually the root cause of most of these exposures, is taking assets from one environment, putting them in another, which unfortunately exposes them to every single attacker in the world.
Interesting. Thank you, Matt. For those of you listening, if you want to look at these stats, if you want to understand the details and their potential impact, I would highly recommend that you download the latest 2023 Unit 42 Attack Surface Threat Report. You should be able to find a link to it in the resources section. If not, you can go to paloaltonetworks.com and find a copy of it there. Matt, jumping back into the report, one of the other interesting findings was about how 80% of all attack surface exposures were found in the cloud. Now, why is there such a large concentration of attack surface exposures in the cloud?
Based on our findings, based on talking with our customers about the root causes of why we find 80% of our exposures in the cloud, our view is it comes down to the cloud offers both a lot of leverage, but also a lot of single points of failure around individual developers. And in particular, individual developers doing things outside of sanction controls. So let's take an example with on-prem. You have to have a number of checks. Systems have to be physically provisioned. There are a number of different teams involved. It's very hard for one individual person to create and expose 1,000 systems to the internet. In contrast, in cloud, if just one engineer or contractor has a purchasing card, if they want to, they can actually stand up a number of systems on their own very quickly in software. And it's also very easy for them to both inadvertently scale that number very high, again, because it's one click with software. So that's what we found, is that it's typically not teams doing known things that are experienced with cloud in known environments. It is instead the fact that inexperienced developers can do very large scale activities, including outside of sanctioned environments. And that multiplies across your entire organization. That is the best explanation we found as the root cause of that statistic.
Right. Ross, staying on this cloud attack surface, one of the things that the research team found was that nearly 90% of these exposures that they found in the cloud attack surface were related to end-of-life services and systems. How common is it for opportunistic attackers to go after these end-of-life systems?
Yeah, thanks, Abhi. So this is really a combination of two trends that we've seen. One is a migration to cloud, which offers all kinds of opportunities and modernization opportunities as well. The other is that end-of-life systems, legacy systems that are in on-prem environments may simply be what we call lifted and shifted into a cloud environment. They might not be adequately secured, upgraded, et cetera. But many times developers and IT teams think, well, because they're in the cloud, things are in better shape. And they might be in terms of availability, but they might not be in terms of security. Again, it comes down to intentionality here. So when you look at the ease with which a simple misconfiguration in a cloud environment can cause a lot of problems, and the tendency for individuals to put older systems in a cloud environment, think that they're okay, you get this sort of nightmare scenario where you've got an end-of-life system that is just low-hanging fruit for an attacker in an environment with maybe not as many controls as developers and IT staff are used to in an on-prem world. And that leads to us seeing these systems attacked aggressively, frequently, and across geographies and industries.
Matt, what are some of the reasons why we're seeing so many end-of-life systems on the cloud attack surface? I mean, clearly organizations understand that these services no longer are supported, so they should ideally be taking them off the internet. What are some ways in which they continue to remain on the internet?
The largest way that we've found end-of-life systems remain in cloud environments is that they're actually part of the software configuration baselines of organizations. And thus, when they get deployed, end-of-life software is actually copied across the organization in an insecure way. This shows both the promise and the peril of going to more cloud-based software configurations. For an on-prem world where you have both hardware and software being run and deployed, you tend to do migrations and upgrades in a piecemeal way over time. So usually some fraction of your systems will be older, some fraction will be newer. In cloud, because of common software baselines and the ability to reconfigure them, you can actually have all systems at the same level, which is a monoculture. And that can be effective if there's effective security controls in place. However, if you have a software baseline that is insecure or old, which in many cases could be, say, hard to update, then unfortunately, you're actually pushing insecurity everywhere instead of having it only be localized in a subset of your system.
Right. So far, we've been talking about the global attack surface. I wanted to take a look at a particular section of the global attack surface, basically take a look at it from an industry viewpoint, which this report also does. When we look at the finance industry's attack surface, Matt, one of the biggest exposures that we see is something called IT and infrastructure exposures. What are these exposures?
IT and infrastructure exposures are very serious because they're associated with typically administrative interfaces for core IT and infrastructure components. So think about how an IT administrator would legitimately log into core networking routers of your company to perform service upgrades and other functions. That is a legitimate IT need for these services to exist. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, they can be deployed in insecure ways, such as having that administrative login be accessible to anyone on the public internet. And when that happens, it is extremely risky for organizations because, one, these assets are typically not monitorable in central ways, such as by installing an agent on them, but they also control very core business functionality, such as managing the enterprise networks of very large banks. And it's that kind of perfect storm that we see of both these being very high impact exposures and also being very prevalent. That's why this is most concerning for finance.
Right. And it's also interesting how unique the attack surface is across organizations. When we look at the attack surface of national governments, we see one of the majority of types of exposure in that particular organization be things associated with insecure file sharing and also database exposures. What are these sorts of exposures? And again, given these organizations, I'm assuming the data within them is going to be extremely crucial.
So as with all of our exposures, there are two primary risks of compromise for having such a system insecurely exposed on the public internet. One is that the exposure itself allows a toehold for attackers where they can then pivot laterally inside the organization. The second, more specific one is that exploitation of certain assets allows attackers direct control of all resources, in particular data that could be resident on the system itself. And for databases and file sharing systems, that second risk is particularly acute because of all of the data that is either stored on those systems or traverses those systems. So in the case of national governments in particular, there can be very sensitive data both about internal operations of the government, including in some cases even their national security apparatus, but it also includes potentially sensitive data about their citizens that will need to support things like tax returns and will need to file those, but want that data to be stored securely.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. For those of you that are watching and listening, we have breakdowns of several other types of organizations covered in this report. Unfortunately, on account of time, we won't be able to go in detail into all of them. So if you'd like to understand how your industry or your organization compares to the industry's attack surface, I'd highly recommend that you go and download this latest report. Again, you can find a copy of it in the resources section of this webinar. or you can go to paloaltonetworks.com, and under Unit 42, you will find the latest 2023 Unit 42 attack surface threat report. Ross and Matt, we're almost at the end of this conversation. So for those of them who have been watching and listening to us so far and who are thinking about attack surface management, Ross, what are some recommendations you would give them in terms of how they can go ahead and start managing their attack surface more actively?
Sure. I think number one, in my days as a practitioner before I was a consultant, frankly, I was too scared to look oftentimes. I didn't want to know what was out there because, there was potentially so much. And the technology also wasn't there. And I think now, with tools like Xpanse, we have that ability to, with high fidelity, attribute assets to organizations and assess, at least roughly, what their risk is in real terms that matter for your business bottom line. So don't be afraid to look. Use a tool that is high fidelity, high confidence that you trust. And if it's still too overwhelming, Unit 42, we offer a service called an attack surface assessment where we will basically kickstart this program for you. So we'll talk to you about your business and security concerns. We will use the data from Xpanse. We will fuse all of that with our threat intelligence and give you a curated report that you can then use to say, wow, we need to change these things right now. And maybe we need to build out a program longer term to make sure that these exposures don't happen again.
Thank you, Russ. Matt, what are your top 3 recommendations for someone who's considering attack surface management?
Number one, have a system to do complete, current, and accurate asset inventory. If you don't have visibility over your assets, especially those in the cloud where things can change every day, the entire rest of your security program is only going to be going after a fraction of the assets that you have. Second, both have a plan and have a program to actually do remediations effectively. Just because you have visibility over things, if you cannot actually effect changes and improve the security of what can be found that way, you're going to know that you have a bad day, but you're not going to be able to prevent it. And the third, to echo Ross's comment, is get the help you need if you don't have it already. There are available services both in-house at Palo Alto and then throughout the ecosystem to actually help you both understand and gain visibility, and then also track down and remediate issues. So those are the 3. Get visibility, be able to remediate, get help if you need it.
Excellent advice. Matt, Ross, thank you so much for taking the time and discussing the latest attack surface threat report with us. For those of you watching, like I said, we only covered a few of the major findings from this report. If you'd like to learn more, you can download the entire report from the resources section of this webinar. If you're not able to find it there, go to Palo Alto Networks and then to Unit 42, and you can download the report there. Thank you so much for taking the time and learning about how the global attack surface is changing and what you need to do to secure your attack surface. Thank you.